welcome to all of you. Last May, Tom Maier wrote his farewell article as an investigative reporter at Newsday before moving on to the editorial board, where he is a columnist. Oh, and also, on the side, preparing as author and a producer, a six-part docuseries, Mafia Spies, for Paramount Plus, based on his book of the same name. And he has a novel coming out this summer. He already has, to his name, an Emmy Award-winning Showtime drama, Masters of Sex, based on another of his 7 books, I think it is. That's so far. The title of that book, by the way, was the answer to a Jeopardy question last month, which is the ultimate sign that you have made it. He's also written books about the Kennedys, the Churchills, and the Churchills and the Kennedys, Dr. Spock, and the Newhouse journalism empire. He has won many awards, including the National Society of Professional Journalists Top Reporting Prize twice, the Columbia University Journalism School's Alumni Award for Career Achievement in 2022, a Silurians, and just this year, a Silurians Excellence in Journalism Merit Award in the Arts and Culture reporting for The Godfather 50 years later. I've known Tom for many years. I worked at Newsday for 33 years, and before leaving 16 years ago, and he has been there 40 years. In April, okay. I have long admired his work, though I've never understood how he does it all, and so well, while remaining a very nice guy, self-effacing and generous in helping fellow journalists. And now he's going to tell us more about his projects and illustrating it with video, and how we too can enter the world of primetime TV. I'll give you Tom Maier.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. You know, I was talking to Joe during the lunch, and I was saying how much the Silurians, to me, was always meant big league journalism here in New York, that they also gave the best dinner of all the awards. Silurians always had the nicest dinner, the best cocktail hour, and such. My first award was back in 1990, and it was for kind of a tough series for New York Newsday. And it just meant a lot that the Silurians recognized the value of that, as Eileen said recently with the Godfather thing. But when I think of the Silurians, the thing that I think about most is in the 70s, I was a student with another kid named Jim Dwyer, who we were on the student paper up at Fordham up in the Bronx. And we had a teacher there whose family, he was a Jesuit priest. He was the author of a number of books. He had a profound impact on Dwyer in terms of as a journalist and such. His family used to were the last owners of the old Brooklyn Eagle. You may remember the Brooklyn Eagle and such. So Ray Schroth was his name, and he was about 6'4", and we were walking up the hill from Fordham up to the D train up in the Bronx. And as the teacher would ask, essentially, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he first asked Dwyer, and I remember Dwyer said he wanted to be like Jimmy Breslin. And then he asked me, he said, who do you want to be like when you grow up, journalistically? And I said, Bob Greene at Newsday. And they both turned and said, who's that? Well, they both learned later on. But the reason why we went to that night to the Silurians, and when we came in, it wasn't at the same place. I forget where it would have been in the late 70s. But again, it was a lovely cocktail hour and such. And I don't know how the teacher got tickets for that, but he brought 2 students. And for me, the Silurians have always been kind of that ideal of big league journalism, and so it's always been in the back of my mind. And I thank you, particularly Eileen, for putting this together. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Essentially, what I'm going to try to talk about today is I've spent the majority of my career as a print writer, print journalist, but particularly in recent years, I've gotten more and more involved with television. As I mentioned, that Jesuit Ray Schroth that I talked about at Fordham, he taught a class about American biography, and we had to read a biography a week, which I'm sure is no big deal for Dan Cryer in the audience, right? But that was a big deal back then, and but in many ways, my book writing career is an extension of that class. It's always been about America in our time, fundamentally, and that's what I've tried to write about. When I went to Columbia Journalism School, though, I had worked for 2 years at a Gannett paper up in Rockland, and I was determined at Columbia Journalism School to learn about television, to learn those set of skills. And I remember my advisor said, "Tom, you don't want to do that," particularly the second half of the year. He said, "You don't want to do that, stay in print." And even for many, many years, and I think it's still to some extent true in the profession, that you're either print or you're broadcast. And I think we are, particularly in the last 20 years, increasingly a multimedia world, and particularly the succeeding generations of journalists have realized that, and they've acquired more and more multimedia skills. So I did do that at Columbia. This is like 1982, and we sold a documentary. It was called "The Mob, the Merchants, and the Fulton Fish Market," and we cribbed liberally from Bob Greene and Tom Renner's clips from Newsday, and we sold it at the Columbia Journalism School to Channel 13. They showed it in June of 1982. But I got a job at the Chicago Sun-Times, and I worked there for 2 years until Murdoch bought the paper. And then 3 of us landed at Newsday, where I worked particularly for Rich Gallant for a number of years. And we did a lot of different projects. And in many ways, that was the heyday of Newsday. Newsday is still making money and still doing well. I don't want to give a misimpression there. But there was a lot of talent there in that room in the 1980s, both out on Long Island and then at New York Newsday. And working for Greene, I was the last one on the Bob Greene's investigative team. And with Greene, and I had this conversation with no less than Robert Caro, who actually worked with Greene and has written about that. But when you work for Greene, he really was a master investigative reporter, but he was a great teacher as well. And the business of how to put together a book and putting together chronologies and seeing things, that was part of the hallmark of Greene's training. Caro, I saw him about 5 or 6 years ago out in the Hamptons at an event, and we talked about that. And it was like as if you had gotten a chip placed in your head that Bob had put in. And so in many ways, I think we're all very fortunate who work with Bob in that regard. But at the same time, we had, in the project, Rich and I worked on a project for more than a year, and the other editor on the project was Newsday's writing coach, a fellow named Harvey Aronson. And the idea that Newsday had a writing coach, and they actually had to think about your writing. Oh no, it's not a reflexive thing. You actually have to think before you write. That was both those sets of skills were something that was a big part of the determination to write books. And so, as Eileen has mentioned, I've written a number of different books. Slowly along the way, I was exposed more and more to something that I intended to do at Columbia, which is do television as well. So when I wrote a book about Dr. Spock, the baby doctor, in the 1990s, the BBC made a documentary of that, and I was a part of that, so I got a little bit of a taste by that. Also, the Dolans bought Newsday about 15 years ago, and I did a lot of projects. In fact, one won a Silurian Award back in 2014 with News 12, which is their local news thing. And Pat Dolan, who is the oldest son of Charles Dolan, the founder of Cablevision, but Pat is the owner of Newsday. He was then the director of news for News 12. So I did a lot of projects with him. And so I learned a lot about script writing. I did a lot of video editing, and you learn about the grammar of film. So it was around that same time that I wrote a book that was actually an assignment I didn't want to do. I came in one day and they said, hey, Maier, we want to do our own story on Dr. Masters, that sex guy who he's retiring, and get him on the horn and see if he could do something. So I got him on the horn. And I was writing a book about Dr. Spock at the time. And I got off the phone. I said, wow, a man and a woman who are not married, studying love and sex, not necessarily in that order, who get married. They're married for 20 years, they become world famous, they become the go-to source on all of this thing, the sexual revolution, and then they get divorced, and nobody knows why. And I said, well, that's a book. And sure enough, when the book came out, that old New York Times ad that said, I got my job from the New York Times. Well, I got my TV series through the New York Times. They reviewed it on the Daily. Dwight Gardner, thank you, Dwight, gave a very lovely review on Friday, and then on Sunday, the Sunday book review came out. So in one weekend, I had 2 reviews in the Times. So we had a couple different people knocking on the doors, and I actually said, I want it as a movie. And once again, I was in error. I was talked into, slowly but surely, a person at Sony who had worked for Jason Epstein at Random House. She was now a Hollywood producer. And she said, she said, this is the golden age of television. There's not only The Sopranos, but look at Mad Men. Mad Men was particularly the go-to example. Excuse me, during that time period. To be honest, I was so busy. We have 3 kids. My wife, Joyce. Hello there, Joyce. And I had 3 kids. I barely watched television. So I watched Mad Men. Oh, now I get it with Mad Men. So we went with Sony, and they developed it, and they sold it to Showtime. And what I didn't realize at that point was that this was kind of the golden age of cable television. And that's a distinctly different time. Although it's only 10 years ago, it's a very different time than the age that we're living in right now. But let me just show you, if I can, just a quick clip, and I hope I haven't totally screwed this up. Bill Masters was a tough, ambitious, hard-driving doctor, probably the best doctor in St. Louis, certainly in the OBGYN field.
God may have created the heavens and earth, but he's not an obstetrician.
He was also a fertility expert as well.
We've been trying for 6 months, since the wedding night.
And there were couples who were having difficulty conceiving, looking to have a baby, and he would help them.
So you have intercourse regularly?
Pretty much like rabbits.
Honey.
And it's actually out of that work that kind of helped inspire his interest in sexuality and understanding how the body works.
There are libraries on how babies are born and not a single study on how babies are made.
I think the most important thing to understand with Masters is his ambition.
We are doctors, for Christ's sakes, and I simply want to answer the question, what happens to the body during sex?
Behind all that ambition was a man who had a troubled childhood, who was very much determined to make a name for himself. He wanted to win a Nobel Prize.
I want to make my name in uncharted territory. I want a Nobel Prize.
And I think that ambition, the hurt from his own childhood, were some of the fuels that drove Bill Masters to become the famous character that he did indeed become. So that clip was made by Sony as part of the whole aspect of promoting the show. After that show ran for 4 years. I learned a lot from that. Joyce and I would go out to Los Angeles every summer, and that's when they were filming it. And they let us sit right behind the directors, and we got to know Michael Apted. I don't know if you knew Michael Apted or recognize him, but he became a friend and actually gave Joyce a kiss and said, "How about we try to get rid of this guy," pointing to me. But Michael is deceased, but he did the 7 Up series, and he was a lovely man. But I learned a lot of things about the business and such. One of the things I learned about Hollywood, which is different, newspaper, you write for a newspaper, there's the general, then there's the colonel, then there's the captains, corporates, and usually the reporters are the buck privates or whatever, go out there and fire or whatever. But it's a very hierarchical structure. Book writing is different because an idea can make it's a flatter hierarchy. And I also noticed that about Hollywood to some extent as well, that there's 2 letters that are very important in Hollywood. It's called IP. What's IP? Intellectual property. In other words, your book is that property. They refer to it as IP now. They don't even call it intellectual property. It's IP. Oh, very good IP. He gives very good IP. So having that IP, I noticed that suddenly people were asking me, "What else do you have, kid?" You had this is a TV show that's a hit. And so that was a very eye-opening experience when we were out there as well. One of the things I sold to, Eileen had mentioned that I wrote a book about the new houses. And I wrote that up as a treatment and sold it to Sony. And then I also sold to Sony a book that I did right around that same time about the Churchills and the Kennedys, kind of like The Crown, if you've watched The Crown at all. It's kind of like the same type of drama and such. And actually that also went at one point to Warner Brothers as well. But at lunch, particularly when I talk about suddenly with IP and they say, what else do you have, kid? We were invited to lunch twice, by 2 different summers, by Peter Roth, who, for those of you who know Newsday, reminded me of Howie Schneider, kind of an impresario, and we went to lunch, and he actually introduced me to Chuck Lorre, who made millions for Warner Brothers, and he was so proud to introduce me to Chuck Lorre. I had no idea who Chuck Lorre is, which I'm sure was, but I have subsequently learned a lot about Chuck Lorre. But at lunch with Peter, he said, so you sold the Churchill Kennedys to Sony's. We wanted it, but do you have any other ideas? What else are you working on these days? And I said, well, what I'm working on, but I haven't written a single word yet, is 2 gangsters hired by the CIA to kill Castro and what happened to them. And it's been kicking around in the back of my mind and for a while. And he said, great, let's do it. I said, Peter, I haven't written the book yet. Said, no, let's do it. We'll put it in the contract. Book TK. Book to come. Right, and we flew back to New York, like my head was spinning by it. So we that became its own story. And it didn't work out with Warner Brothers. And eventually, when the book finally did come out, it was bought by Danny Strong, who's done a lot of different productions. He most recently did for Hulu Dope Sick, which is a terrific series, but he also has won the Emmys for HBO. So he's my go-to guy these days. He's my closest compadre. And he bought it, and then COVID came along, and Danny was going to try to do Mafia Spies. The name of the book is called Mafia Spies. And we were hoping that it would be a drama, but it's really hard to tell people in Hollywood during COVID that, oh, we want to go to Cuba, we want to go to Las Vegas, and so he couldn't sell it as a drama. And I was in a meeting of Newsday's investigative team when I got a phone call in the middle of the meeting from Danny. And I went up, we were all working from home, so I went into another room, and he said, I sold it as a documentary. And I guess I'm really a very poor actor. And he could just tell from the little catch in my voice. I said, oh, and he said, it's all right with you, right, that we sold it? And I have to say, I was, again, kind of like with the movie, I wanted a movie with Masters. I said, I didn't say it to Danny, but I was dubious. But as it turned out, it's gone from eventually to now Paramount Plus in the world of streaming. And that has been a really interesting aspect. Before I forget, I just want to show you the clip. So it just gives you a taste of Mafia Spies for a second.
It's an incendiary fuel that's going to blow.
One of the most difficult things in telling this story. So that's the beginning of, they actually have a teaser and then they have the graphics. And it starts at our house, kind of basically saying, what I basically say there is that everybody lies in this story, and they do. But in any event, so my point with this is saying that this is a whole new world than 10 years ago with Masters of Sex, which was the golden age of cable television. Now it's streaming, and there are a lot of people are flying by the seat of their pants these days, trying to figure out how they grab audiences. We recently got our report card. They do audience surveys with this, and it got very good, a very good report card. So. Because it kind of fits the audience of, Paramount owns The Godfather. They had The Offer, if anybody saw that, on Paramount Plus. So it kind of fits that, their brand, as they say. Just to make a couple of quick suggestions about, for those who may be interested in trying to translate their print, their IP, into television or film. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is, most of my career, my professional life, has been as a lone wolf investigative reporter. In fact, actually, I once went to lunch with with Rich and said, "Please let me work alone." That was the upshot of no meetings, fewer meetings. I'll get it to you faster. I promise. Television is completely different. It's a collaborative process. It's trying to find out, the group of talents, how that, also writing for the eye. I think that's good advice, regardless of whether or not your book becomes, or your article becomes, a TV series or not. The cinematic aspect, those moments that are cinematic, they're often very descriptive, and writing for the eye. Ultimately, television, you realize it's all about the writing as well. It's the script. It's something that I didn't think was necessarily important, but writers really, showrunners are given a great deal of freedom in television. The other thing is framing something. Mafia Spies is not a particularly new idea. There was stuff that I got from the JFK assassination papers that President Trump released about 5 years ago, and some of that helped inform my book. But that story has been out there for a while, but it was framed around the two gangsters. And so in many ways, like in Hollywood speak, it was kind of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, the two meet Godfather Part 2. That, like, as the background of it. And that's really the story of Sam Giancana, who was the head of the mob, and his buddy was this guy, was the mob's guy out in Hollywood and then in Las Vegas, a guy named Johnny Roselli, and that he was the one who really caught my eye. So it's their relationship, these two buddies, two very different types of men, but also very bloody killers. But Johnny was a really suave guy. I mean, Johnny worked for Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures. He dated Lana Turner. Donna Reed he dated, Oh my God. So those two, the idea of having these two buddies and you follow them over the course of this thing, that's the grabber for me. And so framing any story, any project, I think is really key. In pitching something, somebody already asked me today about pitching and about translating a book. One of the things I learned is I had a pilot of Masters of Sex, and there's lots of other books about how to write a script. But when I pitched a book, what I would do is give them about a 10-page memo. And it first had to do, the first 2 or 3 pages had to do with the pilot. Then another 2 or 3 pages, they were just paragraphs, elaborated paragraphs of the key characters, because television's so character-driven. And then the back half of it, the back third of it, had to do with how this could be translated into a multi-part series. That is really key, that when we talk about IP, that when somebody like Peter Roth looks at this, it's not so much that they're saying, oh, a theoretical idea. They're saying, if this hits, if this works, it generates about $400 to $500 million for the company. So IP is really important, and suddenly you're important in their eyes. So pitching it with that type of device, I think, is a way that I would suggest. The other thing that we got back from the report card on Mafia Spies is that the audience, and they tested it in 8 different countries as well as the United States, is that they said, was this fact-based? Was this true? And I guess in the era of Trump, everything we ask, is it true? How do we know it's true? And so the fact that it's based upon a book with more than 500 footnotes and all these other characters, Chris Matthews is in it, Tim Weiner from the New York Times, who wrote the book about the CIA and then the FBI, he's in it. James Kaplan, who wrote the biography, terrific biography of Frank Sinatra, who's also a big character in this. He's in it. So, and it was interesting the way they put it all together. I learned a lot, but I think it's at the tip of the spear of the world of streaming, and where how Netflix is so documentary driven and such, and how you present that to an audience is still emerging. And so I think this will be a big part of that conversation. And so, interestingly enough, in July, I'll become a 68-year-old first-time novelist. And I have a little handout of both Mafia Spies, and it's called Montauk to Manhattan. And it's about a reporter who writes a novel that gets signed up by a big TV, kind of a Harvey Weinstein character, and they make it out, they're making the TV show out in Montauk at the same time the reporter is working for a well-known newspaper. It's the summer of 2016. He's like the third banana covering Trump in the rise of Trump. So that is not true. That's all made up. It's a novel. But I have to say some of this experience did inform that novel. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
The short question is, how do you do it all? Let me retrace that. You're working full-time for a newspaper, and you're writing, 5 books and scripts, etc.? You have a family. How is that possible?
Well, you know what they pay at Newsday, at any newspaper. So, you have 3 kids, they want to go to college, you have to make a few bucks. I could have driven a truck or whatever, or gotten a job at McDonald's. It's virtually the same amount of pay when you're writing books, at least initially. But also I wanted to be a writer. It only makes sense to me if you just say, I want to be a writer, and I'm just going to devote as much. Practically speaking, being an investigative reporter, you're doing one subject very deep, but you're able to manage that more than if you're doing many subjects only so deep.
Where do you find the time?
Well, in a nutshell, I barely, no. I would, and Joyce can attest to this, basically I would get home from Newsday about 6 to 7, we'd have dinner, and by 9 o'clock I would work from 9 until 1 every night, and then get up shit-faced and then go to work the next day. And then on weekends, I'd say about 5 to 6 hours I'd try to sneak in. And, Joe Berger and I were just talking about this. It's kind of like the squirrel that runs out and gets a nut and puts the nut in the tree, preparing for winter. It's kind of like you run out every day. If you do something for the book every day, by the end of the year, lo and behold, you have a book. And it is manageable. I wrote about history. I didn't write anything off the news. If I did, I think that I would have been in a completely different circumstance. There's a Newsday editorial writer who just recently left the paper. He did a book about Santos, and he found it necessary to leave. So, but I was able to manage it that way.
So you must incorporate events that you've shared with your colleagues. How do you approach the issue of intellectual property when you're relating stories told to you by your pals?
I've never wrote a story, my favorite crime. I never wrote a book that was as told to. I never wrote a book that was the story of my beat. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I always wanted to do something that was different than what I was doing at Newsday. And I've been pretty circumspect about what I'm writing. I would tell people, I would put my cards on the table. I know when I did the Newhouse book, I don't think people were all that thrilled because Newsday had just gotten Parade magazine from the Newhouses. But they didn't interfere with that. I don't think it all affected my work. Actually, I think if I was an editor, God forbid, of a newspaper, I would look for multimedia writers who just are writing all the time, who do books, because I think that informs. Newsday has had a tremendous, not necessarily by design, but has had Les Payne. He just won posthumously won the Pulitzer for his biography of Malcolm X. Dan Fagan, who worked at Newsday, covered the environment. He won the Pulitzer about 10 years ago. A number of different people have written books. So I just think it's good. If the more you swing the bat, the more you learn about the world, the better you're going to be as a journalist. Yes?
What was your role in actually writing the script? You hear stories about writers being at the bottom of the hierarchy and having no control over that.
Well, I tried to get into the union of the writers, and that's a big difficulty, and it gets into healthcare and all these other different factors. I would send memos to the showrunner of Masters of Sex, Michelle Ashford. From the very outset, we had a lot of conversations about how you start the show. The way the show started in the pilot is actually from chapter 8, and it's different than the way I started the book. When they asked me, though, how do you think we should start it? And they knew what they had in mind anyway. I said, you should start it with that scene in chapter 8. So we were pretty much on the same, but I did not write, because I'm not a member of the writers union out there. I was not able to write a script. Now I've gotten into other contracts that should you make this into, Tom will become a writer that way. With a documentary, I'm more familiar with the form, and so I was more involved with this. I'm also, as you can see, I'm kind of the narrator for the 6-part, it's almost a 6-hour series. So I'm kind of the narrator. I move the ball along. There's a lot of people like Chris Matthews who talk about it. But so I was much more involved with that, and that's why, I'm a producer. I was a producer with Masters of Sex as well. I think sometimes writers give away the store too quickly. I think I have a very, very good entertainment attorney out in Los Angeles. He's been a very close friend of mine for 20 years. He represents Nicholas Sparks. He's going to be in town next month for The Notebook, that's now a musical. And actually, we are hoping Masters of Sex becomes a musical, believe it or not. Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, Masters and Johnson. He looked out for me. I think some writers give away the store too quickly. They don't get credit, they don't get paid for things. And they should hold out for it. They'll cough it up if you have the right attorney.
Tom?
Yes?
How do you describe being edited, since your venues have varied? And as you know, some copy editors want a newspaper, I won't name which one, can be very picayune. But
Never. We're on tape here.
So how does it vary?
Well, it's a very different situation. With newspapers, as I said, it is very hierarchical. And so, because you have to get the paper out the next day. A lot of it, that organization is because you have to be sure that you get the paper shows up at the doorstep the following day. It depends. Generally speaking, it's funny because with Mafia Spies, we filmed it for 3 days. They put me up in a hotel. Joyce and I were at a hotel, but they filmed at a former speakeasy on the east side here in Manhattan, and you just saw a little bit of that last clip. That's where it was, and it initially started as a Q&A about the book, and eventually I just said to the showrunner, I said, we both read the book, we're both making this thing. Tell me, what exactly do you want me to say? Don't let me start, digressing and going off. And so, they have their own needs, and they're very different from a newspaper's needs. And so eventually you kind of get the sense of that. We've laughed about that recently, that for that 3 days, it was just, okay, tell me exactly what you want to say. And then I practiced just literally getting those lines out effectively in front of a camera.
Tom, back here.
Yes.
Thank you. First, thank you so much and congratulations on all your success.
Thanks.
Just to take you back a minute, so you told us, you mentioned you have a great entertainment lawyer. Did you or do you have a literary agent who is experienced in, turning her clients' works into TV and movies?
Yeah, right now I'm represented by the Gersh Agency, which is one of the bigger agencies out there. I've had 2 really terrific literary agents, though, in the past. One was Faith Hamlin, was at Sanford Greenberger, and my entertainment attorney is the counsel for them. That's, in fact, that's how Nicholas Sparks, it was the same agency and such. This is back in 1989, early 90s. And then the last 10 years or so, I had another attorney, another literary agent, John Wright, and he passed away. He represented Robert Dallek and a number of other historians, biographers, and such. But basically, it's been my literary agents that have been really central to being and Scott Schweimer, who is my entertainment attorney. Actually, as much as anybody, Scott has been the constant in my career.
Why haven't you, first of all, thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Joe.
Why haven't you gone whole hog Hollywood? Give up newspaper.
Well, I wrote a book about the Churchills and the Kennedys, and there was a scene in that book where Randolph Churchill, the only son of Winston, wanted to show that he was a brave guy, so he joined a group of commandos. I'm going to answer your question, I promise. But there's a scene where they open up the door and they're flying low. It's in what is now, I guess, Hungary, and he slipped the guy 5 pounds to give him a boot, so he would jump out of the plane with the parachute because he would just freeze in front of the door. I've been at that door several times in the last 10 years, and every time I freeze, I say, I like newspapers, we're not sure. Because you never really, I had one project where we were going to Scotland, and it was all set, they were sending it, and the bottom fell out at the last minute, and we got a call on a Friday after we had gone to dinner, and I looked like Lincoln after he had been shot. I mean, I just was stunned by that. So since then, I've learned, bird in the hand, perhaps overly cautiously. But I also like everybody who's ever worked in a newsroom. There's a certain cocaine aspect of the newsroom. That the news is fun, and to the extent that you can kind of keep your toe in there, or your part of your body at least in there. That's how I've been able to balance it. Hello there, Cheryl.
Cheryl has a question.
Probably the most important question of this discussion. Why did Masters and Johnson get divorced?
I am so glad you asked that question, because we never got to that point. They ended it when they got married. There was like another 20 years. And that's why I said it was one of the great, amazing love stories. At the beginning of my book, I'm going to give you a quick answer. I'm going to try it. At the beginning of my book, it's how Virginia Johnson loses her virginity. She's 16 years old, and she's with a boy with, she described it, she wouldn't tell me his name. I found a boy with fiery red hair. I eventually found out from, and she was in a little town called Golden City, Missouri, population 800. And she described how she lost her virginity. I mean, after all, it is pertinent to the subject matter. So what happened is that Bill Masters, had a lost love from his youth. Both of them had lost contact with the earliest loves. And then at the end of their lives, Masters bumps into this lost love, and on Christmas Eve tells Virginia, that's it, no more, we're done. And at the end of the book, Virginia Johnson goes back looking for her lost love, the boy with fiery red hair. And that's the end of the book, and I'm not going to spoil it for you. You'll have to read that book to find that out.
Are you writing for a specific audience? That's A. B, what do you think about the younger people now who are just coming into the media, watching it, listening over the internet? Are you including them in what you're trying to write about?
Well, to be honest, I think I'm clueless to some extent. The fact that we have 3 sons in their 30s, my youngest son is involved in the media. He's the one who keeps me grounded, explains certain things. Oh, Dad, okay, this is what this means, and stuff like that. I do think the streaming world is a completely different world. I think they are flying by the seat of their pants. They may say, oh, we've got it, don't worry. But they're flying by the seat of their pants. They know it. And anybody who's really involved with it knows it. And they're trying to find out what the audience wants. And who, anyone under 35, probably anyone under 50, is getting their television by a smart television with apps that have been installed or come installed already in it. And they decide what they want. And watching Tony Gatta on Channel 4, which, right?
Or 2.
Or 2. They're finding.
Keep a job.
Well, no, of course you could. They're finding Channel 2 or Channel 4 through Pluto and Tubi and all these other different ad-driven channels. And so basically, if you really step back and you look at television, you had the rabbit ears era from the first 30, 40 years or so. Then cable came into its own from the 1970s, really until about 5 years ago. And now we are in that third realm, which they thought would repeat cable television, the golden age. They thought, well, the streamers will be just like cable. But now they're finding, and with Mafia Spies, for instance, you get to a certain point, pause, and now you have an ad. You know, it's not ad-free like HBO or Showtime. There were no ads in Masters of Sex. In Mafia Spies or any other type of really popular, hopefully popular with us, but in streaming, it's ad-driven as well. So I think the 3 stages of television, we're just beginning that third stage, and I think that's there. That's the younger generations. That's something that's very different from our experience.
I started reading your book, Masters of Sex, and it's great.
Thanks.
I had a special interest in this because I can't imagine how I missed it when it first came out, but I did. William Masters was an alumnus of Hamilton, class of 38.
Yes.
This is my alma mater.
Uh-huh.
And I was always wondering whether, was at that time a very austere place. It was all male. Snow fell from October to May. If you wanted a date, you sometimes had to drive 150 miles. So I was kind of wondering whether you picked up any sense that, it was a sex-starved, horny place before the girls got there. Did that have anything to do with his obsession?
Well, Masters was really wary of being perceived as some sex-starved pervert. He was a masterful OBGYN. He was the well-known OBGYN out there. And so the reason why he became partners with Virginia Johnson is that a lot of female doctors did not want to get involved with this. I mean, for Masters, understanding how the body works through the fundamental act of procreation, how the progression of the species takes place, and everybody knew that, but they didn't want to detail it. Kinsey he was well aware that that shop had gone way off the rails in terms of their private lives, and anybody who's familiar with either the Kinsey biographies or the movie understands that. So Masters was almost like a Puritan in that regard, except that when the only person that he could get really was Virginia Johnson, who had this native understanding of how to convince nurses and doctors' wives and all these volunteers to be part of their sexual studies. It was Virginia who made everything possible. She also understood a lot about the treatment that they used, and which was a sensate, basically a touch, it's escaping my brain right now, the term, but it's basically teaching the body through touch and such. She developed that, and that was a very effective technique. But Masters, in a nutshell, was very wary of not being perceived as some nut.
Thank you for coming and enlightening people. Thank you.